We're gonna just go ahead and hop right in. Hope you guys are in the right place. This is Migration and Geographies in Art, Literature, and Culture, but I'm pretty sure you are, or else you wouldn't listen to Dr. McCormick's spiel.
Okay.
So we're gonna start first with Alexandra Edwards, featured as landscapes in American literature and filmic regionalism. And she is also a TCU professor, so let's give her a round of applause.
Yes.
Going over there?
Yes. Do you have a clicker?
I do have the clicker.
Awesome.
Does it?
Okay.
Oh my god, it does click. Beautiful. All right. Hi. Oh my gosh, thank you guys so much for coming today. Thank you especially to, I see a bunch of my students who came. You guys are so sweet. Thank you. And thank you also to Stacy and all of my colleagues in Crest for organizing such a wonderful conference. So we are gathered today on land that is the traditional and unceded territories of the Wichita and affiliated tribes. But I'm going to ask everyone here to travel with me briefly, at least in our minds, to the hardwood swamp and piney flatwoods of Central Florida, the lands and territories of the Ice, Appalachee, Calusa, Timucua, and Tocobago tribes, as well as the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. These are lands that sheltered Africans escaping enslavement as early as 1689. Lands where the indigenous survivors of Spanish and British settler colonialism retreated, banding together with free Africans and those escaping enslavement. These swamps and sandhills are where the three Seminole Wars of Florida were fought during the 19th century, as the United States sought to destroy these Native and Black communities who were putting up armed resistance to forced relocation and re-enslavement. Now, the year that we're visiting is 1928, or maybe it is 1929, and we're traveling through a stand of longleaf pine that is currently being logged by a crew of Black workers for the Everglades Cypress Lumber Company. The pines grow from sandy soil interspersed with sable palms and an understory of saw palmettos looking something like this image here. We might have arrived to this place on a brick road that was built by convict labor, which still runs through Laufman, Florida. It's just southwest of Orlando. The men that we are about to see might be convicts themselves, men who have been arrested for spitting on the sidewalk or for simply not having a job. Until the 1940s, their unpaid legal fines could be bought by the lumber company, who would then force them to work until they said that the debt had been paid. And our guide on this visit is Zora Neale Hurston, and we're about to see the logging camp as she would have seen it through the eye of her camera lens.
When I get in Illinois, I'm going to spread the news about the Florida boy. Shove it over. Hey, 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 you catch a line and oh, shack a like a catch a moving. Hey, 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 you catch a sign. Eat him up whiskers, but he won't shave. Eat him up body like he won't pay. Shove it over. Hey, 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 you catch a line and oh, shack a like catch it moving. Hey, 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 you catch it dry. Oh, the rooster chew tobacco, the hen dipple snuff. The biddy can't do it, but he struts his stuff. Shove it over. Hey, 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 you catch a line there. Oh, shack a like catch it moving. Hey, 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 you catch it dry. In all the big work camps, sawmills, and turpentine steel and road camps, and whatnot, they have a man to go down and wake up the camp. And he has their chants and hollers to wake them up, and sometimes he makes them up as he goes along. Well, I heard these at Laufman, a big sawmill down in Polk County. Wake up, bullet, get on the run, take white Davis 5 o'clock. Come up on that cover, bullets. Come on up on that cover unless you want
Hurston shot and or directed about 85 minutes of footage. It's not totally clear when she was operating the camera and when she was directing another camera person. But much of that footage she shot, let me get back there. There we go. Much of that footage she shot in Florida during the late 1920s, and unfortunately only some of it survives today. This footage is generally understood to be part of her ethnographic fieldwork, as Gloria Gibson has written an outgrowth of her work as an anthropologist. Where pieces of her film footage have been preserved and anthologized, they generally appear under titles like fieldwork footage, and I apologize for the formatting error there, but fieldwork footage or ethnographic films is the other title it often appears under. In this way, scholars and film preservationists today continually assert to us that this footage is documentary. But that insistence has the consequence, and it is probably unintentional, but it still has the consequence of abstracting it from Hurston's fairly extensive network of filmmaking connections. And we've only recently begun to think of Hurston as a filmmaker based almost entirely on the discovery of this footage that she created, which was found in a collection of Margaret Mead's papers in 1995, and that's part of why it gets filed under ethnographic work. But Hurston, like so many other American writers of her time, had a career that continually crossed paths with film as both a medium and an industry. So for example, she worked for, befriended, and corresponded with novelists like Fannie Hurst and Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, both of whom sold the adaptation rights to multiple novels and stories to Hollywood and had successful commercial hits made out of their made adaptations of their work. Hurston's own novels were actually read by Warner Brothers and other major Hollywood studios, but ultimately went unpurchased and unadapted during the studio era. She also worked as a writer and a technical advisor for Paramount for about 2 months in late 1941, although we don't know what project specifically she was working on. So today I set out to start to thread all of these bits and pieces together, and it led me to a place where I really started asking myself how we can contextualize Hurston's film work in light of these connections that I mentioned. Here I'm following the work of Autumn Womack, who warns us about the, quote, critical tendency to assess early Black cinema within the terms of accuracy, objectivity, and documentary, end quote, and who reorients readings of Hurston's film footage toward a concern with what visual technology can and cannot convey. Which brings me back again to this footage of the logging camp. Now, not visible in these shots of skinny pines and clumping palmettos is that history that I acknowledged earlier, that these swampy stands of trees were once home to maroon communities and indigenous people who were actively refusing relocation, that they were landscapes sheltering fugitives from state terror. We can see the loggers even here, but we can't see their life stories, and we can't know how they ended up working for the Everglades Cypress Logging Company. So we can't know, for example, if any of these men pictured are the quote-unquote convict laborers. We can begin here to glimpse the fugitivity of the landscape itself, that is, the effects of heavy logging on the area, which will eventually decimate the flatwoods and forested wetlands of central Florida. But we can't see what that project is going to look like in the future, nor can we see what has already been lost, nor, also, can we see the compounding effect of the drainage projects that fragmented the Everglades, projects that were dreamed up by the state during the Second Seminole War of 1836 to 1842, and were really seen as a way to break indigenous resistance. A lot of what we do know about this footage doesn't come from the footage itself. It comes from Hurston's 1935 collection of folk tales titled Mules and Men, where she writes about visiting the lumber company in Loughman, Florida. Oddly enough, Hurston never mentions in the book that she was shooting reels of film while she was on this trip. So here, we think we have reconstructed a series of events, but if we look again at just the footage, which, again, we have been told is documentary, what really becomes apparent is how little we can actually confirm by watching it. So given what we can and can't see here, I start to ask myself, If this footage is documentary, what do we really have documented? We don't know the exact year it was shot. We don't know the specific location it was shot in. We don't know the names of the men shown. We don't even know who operated the camera. So what do we know? And then I start to ask, what can we know, right? Pushing at these questions, Thank you. I'm going to go back to that in just a second. Pushing at these questions leads me to the work of Jane Gaines, who's very helpful, I think, in challenging film scholars and historians to account for, but also to complicate the special indexical privilege that has been assigned to the surviving film print as the object of inquiry in film studies. The point, she writes, is to take into account how photosensitive film is thought to index whatever was put in front of the camera. But as we've seen here, it doesn't do that, right? It can't. So Gaines writes, the extant film print itself is no final proof of the existence of past events, and therefore the surviving object alone may not put an end to questions about what actually happened behind or in front of the camera loaded with light-sensitive film stock. What we cannot deny is that the artifact is but a tiny piece relative to the rest of the past. Indeed, it is given inordinate significance relative to its fractional portion. So as I'm thinking about this, then I start to ask myself, as someone who's working with this material, like what are we supposed to do, right? Do we throw our hands up and do we say like, oh, well, we just can't know, so we can't know? Oh well. That's not an option that really satisfies me as a scholar. And so into the spaces that are left unindexed by these primary source documents, I want to bring Sadia Hartman, whose Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments radically reimagines what kinds of stories we can tell from the archives. So Hartman writes, every historian of the multitude, the dispossessed, the subaltern, and the enslaved is forced to grapple with the power and authority of the archive and the limits it sets on what can be known, whose perspective matters, and who is endowed with the gravity and authority of historical actor. She writes that she prefers to think of her book, Wayward Lives, as the fugitive text of the wayward. In this spirit, she says, I've pressed at the limits of the case file and the document, speculated about what might have been, imagined the things whispered in dark bedrooms, and amplified moments of withholding, escape, and possibility. So, this project is at its very, very, very nascent, just beginning stages. And I'm just running down to the end of my time, and so I'm going to conclude here by saying that what I've presented has so much further to grow, and the project will eventually take up instances of fugitivity in the work of other women filmmakers of color who are working in the first decades of the 20th century, whose work mostly exists for us just in fragments today. And so here we can see two other filmmakers I do plan to write about, Marion E. Wong and Maria P. Williams. And Marion E. Wong is an especially interesting person to think about because she produced and directed a feature-length film in 1916 or 1917, so much earlier than we normally think of women of color making films. My hope in the project is to put all of these fragments together and then see if they can yield something that lets us, in Hartman's words, speculate about what might have been, both in front of and behind the camera. Thank you.
Next, we will have Dr. Jalahara from TCU. Her project is Mangoes from the Motherland, Diaspora Poetry and Oral Histories to Convey Stories of Migration.
I'm going to start my timer here as well. Okay, I've had a slight change in my title, so it's now Navigating Identity and Migration Through Oral Histories and Storytelling and Punjabi Dubbing. Before I start, and as I think about in preparation for this talk, I have been thinking extensively about justice and migration. It feels remiss to think about these topics without acknowledging the relentless violence and injustice happening against cousins, many who are forced to migrate from their homes. I think about the many forced migrations throughout history and the impact of displacement on the physical body, the mind, and the resulting generational trauma, leading many to utilize oral histories as a method for healing and conservation of personal narratives. Transcending boundaries, language is utilized as a method for connecting to community and assorting cultural legacies through traditions of storytelling, often through oral recitation of poetry to preserve cultural heritage. In this paper, I examine how oral histories and oral storytelling have informed the contemporary South Asian diaspora identity and continue to influence the reimagination of social and physical landscapes beyond the metaphysical and physical borders, cemented through colonial legacies while also building solidarity among members who have been subject to division, often via imperial subjugation. Furthermore, the paper envisages a larger research project that aims to examine the evolution and formation of hybrid language in the diaspora and its connections to the resurgence of interest in oral history storytelling traditions such as Punjabi Dafe. Oral storytelling of various forms has played a vital role in asserting a voice for the underrepresented while narrating stories of joy and trauma. In addition to literary and creative forms of expression, such as poetry, to explore identity and engage with the decolonization of ethnic narratives, many what are called children of the diaspora or third culture kids are utilizing digital media to explore various aspects of their heritage, including ancestral language, or in some instances languages, and forms of oral storytelling. Oral history has played an especially monumental role in preserving histories of migration outside of a Eurocentric and colonial lens. For many South Asians, oral history projects, such as the 1947 Partition Archive, which this is a just brief slide showing their, like the main website from the 1947 Partition Archive. These have served as a platform to not only document and preserve stories of migration, but as surveyed by Pippa Verdi, to subvert colonial narratives of the outcome of traumatic events such as the partition. Aiming to form and understand aspects of their identities, many from the South Asian diaspora have utilized oral histories told by family and community members to piece together what are often painful legacies. Before moving forward, I think it's important to highlight some historical aspects of the partition in South Asian history that will provide context to the South Asian diaspora and the literary and oral tradition of Dafe. The 1947 partition references the largest mass migration in history, which was the violent outcome of the arbitrary geographical borders created by the British upon their departure from the Indian subcontinent. Celebrations of independence from centuries of imperial rule were overshadowed by bloodshed, as over 2 million lost their lives during this time. Over 15 million were displaced from their homes as the two nation states of India and Pakistan were carved out of what was once British India. And people were forced to migrate across physical borders and choose a new homeland, primarily based on religious identity. The two regions most impacted by partition were the northwest region of Punjab and the northeast region of Bengal. It is important to mention that the Indian subcontinent is ethnically, linguistically, culturally, and religiously diverse. While there are many shared elements among different groups, the homogenization of these groups is a direct result of colonization that continues to impact the South Asian diaspora today. The South Asian identity categorization is quite broad, and the region, as this shows, consists of the following countries. Some of the countries also fall under other geocultural, geopolitical regions, and the ones most impacted by partition are underlined in red: India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Pakistan and India both share the region of Punjab, which was brutally split during partition, forcing people to choose nationalist allegiance over linguistic and cultural similarity, with the majority of Muslim Punjabis now living in Pakistan and Hindu and Sikh Punjabis in India. While the subcontinental politics is relevant in the diaspora, many diaspora Punjabis reimagine boundaries by finding community among one another and creating social landscapes based on their shared heritage. English, a language reinforced by colonial rule, has become a shared language and remnants of colonial legacy among those in South Asia, as well as the English-speaking diaspora, where it is often a first language, if not in spoken language, then in written and reading language. The use of the English language continues to reinforce the socioeconomic hierarchy imposed by the British in South Asia and serves as a connection to imperial rule, as well as in new homelands for the diaspora. Decolonization efforts have led many in the diaspora to navigate their third culture identity and find or renew interest in their ancestral language or languages. The interest is reflected in the oft-critiqued diaspora poem, but also in the recounting of oral histories told by elders as reflected in the 1947 Partition Archive, as well as in oral storytelling via various literary and music genres, which often serve as a form of connection and commonality across physical and metaphysical borders. As members of the diaspora, South Asians, like many immigrant groups, are forced to partake in assimilationist strategies as a means for survival, with subsequent post-first generations engaging in what Melville Herskovitz calls reinterpretation. So this is when hybrid customs were formed and adapted to suit the needs of successive generations. In many ways, South Asian languages have been subject to this. One instance of this is what I am calling an anglicized verbing of particular, often action words or verbs that occurs. So you can follow along with me here as I say this. So one example of this that I'm going to demonstrate is in the languages of Urdu or Hindi. One would say "main ja raha hu" or "main ja rahi hu," depending on the gender of the speaker, to mean I am leaving. But a reinterpreted diasporic version of this would be simply "I'm jotting," a message which would be understood in the right setting. This is a slight tangent from the scope of this paper, but I wanted to include it because, as I mentioned earlier, it's a potential research project in and of itself. But I'm highlighting this specific example because of its connections to the evolving facets of language and communication as reflective of migration. In some ways, I find this akin to the evolution of Spanglish amongst the Latina and Hispanic diasporas. Since language plays such a pivotal role in navigating identity in diaspora, and for many in the South Asian diaspora, even without written or language fluency, partially connected to the script differences that happen in difference to English, so I'm giving an example of some of the script differences of different South Asian languages. Spoken fluency or basic understanding plays a vital role in building connection. Song lyrics in native languages or oral storytelling methods such as Dappe have played a powerful role. Ranjana Saxena purports that the Dappa, as it is called in Hindi, is a result of the blending of various forms of North Indian linguistic, ethnic, and faith-influenced storytelling, poetry, and folk music. Dappe are predominantly found in the northern parts of the Indian subcontinent amongst three primary language groups, called Dappa in Hindi, Topa in Bengali, and Dappe in Punjabi, which will be the focus of this paper. A literary form of semi-classical folk poetry, Dappe are known for their distinct style, performed in a sing-song manner that is ambulatory in nature. While the storytelling nature of Dappe encompasses a variety of topics, its performance is often joyous in nature, even if the message itself is not. Especially if the topic or stanzas convey sorrow, it can still be joyful in its performance. Dappe are often performed at wedding ceremonies, especially in the contemporary diaspora context, but not exclusively. Dappe encompass a spatial recognition that merges the migration patterns and socio-religious cultural mixing that has formed the cultural landscape of northern India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh today, and by extension, inform the diaspora. A form of oral storytelling and as part of linguistic folk music, Punjabi Dappe are having a resurgence of interest in preservation in the Punjabi diaspora, who share heritage from both India and Pakistan. Many who I reference as revitalizationists, based on the term coined by sociologist Anthony Wallace, are utilizing digital media broadly and social media specifically to connect with elements of cultural heritage. This is through a variety of methods, and there's two methods I want to highlight today. The first is wedding festivities, which are often called tolkis. These can be thought of as pre-wedding events in which people gather to play traditional instruments, at the center of which is the tolki itself. This is a small two-handed drum you can see here. And the second image kind of represents what a tolki event would look like. Everyone kind of gathered around the tolki player. And so in this, you often have songs that are sung, and they can also be sung recitations of poetry and different variations of oral storytelling to celebrate the upcoming wedding occasions. It is here that revitalizationists engage both traditional forms of Dappe with increasing popularity. They also sing songs from Western genres, often in English, to the beat of traditional instruments. Second is the emergence and rising popularity of traditional Punjabi dance forms that are Bhangra and Kidda. dance troupe performances. These happen on community levels, and they are also increasingly happening in colleges and universities. These Bhangra and Gidda dance troupes then sing Tappe as part of their performance. In both of these instances, in the wedding festivities and Gidda and Bhangra performances, the theme of Tappe are often the same. However, the style of oral storytelling can vary greatly depending on the needs of the performance. Tappe is not a stagnant art form, and the reciter can employ any message in the story, which is often a well-known Tappe that will be recited, with some slight variation depending on the skill and often improvisational level of the reciter. Many Tappe explore themes of migration, specifically migration through marriage. In many South Asian traditions, the bride leaves her home, this could be her village, her country, etc., to move in with her new husband and his family upon marriage. Containing a bittersweet overtone, certain Tappe highlight the specific migration of a bride to what is considered her new homeland. Likewise, many of these same themes of migration have been used to convey difficult stories of displacement during partition and also highlight or portray the plight of those in the contemporary diaspora. I think for the sake of time, this is just a video showing a performance of get the performance on a community level. And maybe at the end, if I have time, I might show a brief video from it. So thinking about this as well, social media transcends borders and provides a spatial landscape to not only navigate various aspects of identity, but to find connection through linguistic, literary, and oral storytelling components. Various social media accounts promote the use of South Asian languages in their videos and engage in reviving Tappe and other historical forms of oral storytelling. These are some of these accounts here, and they exist on a variety of different social media platforms. Interestingly, it is not only those in diaspora engaging with this content, but there is an interaction and exchange of shared knowledge among those in the countries of origin as well. In many ways, not only are they informing one another, but acknowledging that colonial legacy and sectarian frictions have impacted traditional forms of storytelling and knowledge production. Systems which are shared among these different communities. Recounting oral histories to narrate stories of migration and revitalizing oral storytelling traditions like the Tappe that we discussed today. Decolonizes cultural interpretations and decenters the Western gaze on traditional folk practices. And lastly, aids in reimagining existing borders and landscapes, advocating for solidarity. I wonder, I have a minute. Do you think we can go back and, I don't know if you can click on this. It's the previous one, there's a link right there. If you can just play it, I think, from where, okay, maybe not, that's okay. If you can go into like just maybe 2 minutes. Okay, thank you. So this is just one example that demonstrates a traditional Gidda performance, and what they are reciting is, it can be thought of in this specific clip, they do have Tappe that are incorporated. In this one, they are kind of like transitioning from a Tappa into a traditional like song that would be sung during a wedding ceremony. And the language, the form of oral storytelling, the dance movements that accompany that can really vary depending on the circumstance and the situation. Thank you.
Next, we will have Dr. Zhang. Her presentation is Spiritual Migration, Confinement, and Afterlife of Slavery in Lasada Shakur Zasada, an autobiography, Octavia E. Butler's Kindred, and Incarcerated Men in Parchment/Mississippi State Penitentiary. She is from Washington College. Let's give her a round of applause.
Good afternoon. This chapter is part of my dissertation project. I'm currently revising it, but I want to convert it to book manuscript. My book project is inspired by my students at Parchment, Mississippi State Penitentiary. They recognized my broken voice, and they helped me find home in Mississippi and America. I'm from Korea, so I'm not going to talk about Parchment Prison a lot, but I want to share my student's poem from Parchment because his poem is an example of spiritual migration. So I'm going to read. I don't have interesting PowerPoint slides. So the African American historian and political activist Robin DiGitelli opens his acclaimed book, Freedom Dreams, The Black Radical Imagination, by reflecting on his Black mother's imagination of a new world, fulfilled with hopes and visions. He writes that his mother, quote unquote, has a tendency to dream out loud, and that during these moments of daring vision, quote unquote, her third eye opens onto a new world, and beautiful light-filled place as peaceful as her state of mind. He reveals the visions, hopes, and possibilities that Black writers, artists, and activists imagine. Utopic Black communities that have been liberated from white supremacist capitalists by way of a Black radical imagination, one with a diasporic scope. Despite her socio-economic oppression, Kelly's mother visualizes a free world where Black people take care of and love each other. Her radical imagination is rooted in traditions of Black maternal ancestors, such as the formerly enslaved Black abolitionists Harriet Jacobs, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Tubman. Some of the daughters and descendants in their political lineage, specifically former Black political prisoner Assata Shakur and Dana Franklin, fictional character in Octavia Butler's work of speculative fiction Kindred are the subject of my paper. I contend that Assata and Dana inherited and refashioned the fugitive strategies of Jacobs, Truth, and Tubman, particularly their cultivation of Black radical imagination to subvert and help others to undermine white supremacist systems. In this regard, in her autobiography, Assata reimagines and then reutilizes her grandmother Lulu Hill's fugitive practices in Jim Crow settings, including verbal dexterity, and the reimagining of Black female possibility to subvert racist and sexist stereotype of Black women to undermine the oppressive and dehumanizing carceral environments she confronts in her later generation of liberationist struggle. Similarly, Dana, the 1970s era Black women protagonist of Butler's novel Kindred, who appears as a spirit-like being to her ancestors during her time travel journeys back to slavery's past, draws upon the fugitive tactics of Tubman to facilitate the collective mental decolonization of her enslaved Black ancestors and their envisioning of fugitive pathways to freedom. In particular, Dana protects the enslaved Black children characters, Alice, Luke, Carrie, and Nigel, from internalized oppression and racial violence by instilling the spirit of freedom in their minds and directing them to dream of the possibility of freedom even before they escape from the Antebellum South. She transforms carceral geographies of slavery into fugitive spaces, if only temporarily. In this paper, I examine Black women's spiritual migration and creation of fugitive spaces in Shakur's autobiography and Butler's Kindred. I analyze the role of cultivating a radical imagination, place in the manifestation of spiritual migration as fugitivity in the lives and work of two revolutionary Black fugitive slave figures, Assata and Dana, who undermines their who undermine their recurring confrontations with carceral temporalities and spectral confinement by reimagining and creating safe and liberating spaces for themselves and others. In the context of emerging Black feminist movements and the late 20th century Black freedom movement. Furthermore, by introducing the term spiritual migration in this paper, I intend to emphasize that this practice is a critically underexplored form of fugitivity that figures prominently in post-civil rights era African American literature. My term, spiritual migration, builds on African American critical migration scholar Farah Jasmine Griffin's theory of African American migration and Jarvis Argyle's conceptions of fugitive spirit and the Black curricular imagination. Griffin argues the presence of Black ancestors in Southern cultural forms assist Southern Black migrants to cultivate safe and nurturing spaces in violent urban landscapes. Southern Black migrants' intimate connection with Southern folk culture fosters their resistance to white supremacy while cultivating spaces for their pursuit of freedom, solidarity. Meanwhile, Gibbons investigates Black teachers' fugitive pedagogy. In his view, all Jim Crow Black teachers had carried enslaved Black ancestors' fugitive spirit when creating Black curricula in white supervised schools. Gibbons specifically argues that Black Americans had utilized textbooks, newspapers, journals, and a variety of forms of Black print culture to create culturally affirming learning experiences in Black schools under the surveillance of white supremacy during the expansion of print culture in the 19th century. Gibbons emphasized that narratives of fugitive slaves such as Frederick Douglass and Harriet Jacobs played quote-unquote an integral role in establishing this intellectual tradition. In light of Griffin's discussion of the crucial role of the Black ancestors' presence in Southern Black migrants' lives and Gibbons' concepts of fugitive spirit and the Black curricular imagination, I examine spiritual migration in this paper as a form of fugitivity practiced by real historical and fictional Black women such as Harriet Jacobs' grandmother, Mary Randall from Invisible Man, Sarah's grandmother, Sarah and Dana. By way of example, readers of Jacobs' instance in the life of a slave girl discovers that her grandmother keeps Jacobs in a garret, takes care of Jacob's children, and establishes collective solidarity to assist Jacobs during her 7 years of confinement. Her grandmother's care and love, in coordination with community members, enable Jacobs to create space to build intimacy with their children, regain their motherhood and humanity. The Black radical imagination of Jacob's grandmother thus aids Jacobs in the transforming of the confining garret into a fugitive space within the carceral geography of slavery. Jacob's grandmother's fugitive spirit and Black radical imagination open possibilities for Jacobs and her children to be free mentally and emotionally even before their ultimate physical escape to a freer world than the plantation. This practice exemplifies what I term spiritual migration. In this paper, I demonstrate that Asada and Dana practice spiritual migration by carrying their ancestors' fugitive spirit and by repurposing carceral temporalities and carceral spaces. Asada's grandmother Asada's grandmother teaches young Asada practical skills necessary for creating freedom dreams and fugitive spaces by imparting to her facility with verbal dexterity, affirmations of Black women's dignity and self-respect, and the practice of Black love, care, and empathy while living in the Jim Crow South. Asada's Uryu-Tic mystic to my people broadcast by radio during our incarceration exemplifies spiritual migration by amplifying the heroic history of her Black women ancestors and their radical imaginations, while also invoking an African American vernacular tradition of call and response. Asada creates a fugitive space in which multiple generations of Black people can collectively imagine freedom while forming solidarity and intimacy on the airwaves. Moreover, I make the case that, like Asada, Dana is a contemporary Black woman who carries a fugitive spirit that undermines carceral temporalities and creates fugitive spaces for Black people, especially as she teaches enslaved children reading and writing during her forced time travels to the antebellum South. In sum, I argue that Asada's and Dana's fugitive practices, and especially their enactment of spiritual migration, represent Black feminist expressions of what Kelly discusses as utopic Black community building by way of the Black radical imagination. The impact of Asada's grandmother's spirit is significant, but I will skip this part. So Black women writers, Shakula and Butler, by revealing the power of spiritual migration as a fugitive practice, similarly participate in combating these global forms of afterlife of slavery. The freedom dreaming and fugitive planning of Black women represented in Shakula's autobiography and Butler's novel are as reflective of the legacy of the combined legal collective statement as a mode of empire critique that Erica Edwards highlights in the recent examination of Black women writers of the late 20th century. So before I wrap up, I want to share my student from Parchment Prison, student's poem from Parchment Prison. I want to his spirit is here. That's, his voice travels across time and space. So does anyone want to read his poem? Anyone? Any volunteer? Thank you. Yes, it's okay.
So this is a poem written by Frederick Bell, and it is entitled No Submission. I refuse to be enslaved to the Jim Crow ways. I'm in the white man's war, fighting for freedom, dignity, and integrity. My pride is one thing that truly belongs to me. Yes, my skin is full of melanin, but you choose not to see me. My people endured so much brutality, even when they were on their knees, begging and pleading. The expression that is understood is standing in your truth with the utmost honor and respect, dying as a Black man. Don't think lynching me is going to silence me. My voice will forever be heard through my legacy and community of beautiful Black brothers and sisters. For I am the human sacrifice that died for my race. Let my sacrifice empower my people. No submission. We came from royalty and taught our captors to be civilized. We were removed from our thrones as kings and queens to build the American dream that has not been given to all equally. If you read from the book of the oppressor, we were considered less of a human. We were written as 3/5 of a man. They tried to strip us of our culture and loyalty to our race, but we prevailed. We will no longer submit to their unjust war. Let us not serve the white family at their table after preparing a meal. Let's pull up a chair and eat amongst them. We deserve to have a seat at the table to enjoy the fruit of our labor. Let's stop ironing and washing the white man's clothes. The laundering of washing white sins clean. No longer shall we demand our justice, but we shall take a stand for our justice. Let's break these chains of oppression and generational hurt so that we no longer sing the Black national anthem, We Shall Overcome. We will soon sing We Have Overcome with no submission, no submission, no submission. And we're out.
journal I'm co-editing. I'm still recruiting contributors, so you can see the blog like on the counter. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, we have Dr. Davis, all the way from Middleburg College, with the Geographies of Black Trans Thought.
Thank you all, and yes, I'm coming from Vermont, but I'm originally from Texas. I've only been living there for 2 years, so glad to be back. Okay, so today I am hoping to talk about a project that is a combination of some of the dissertation research as well as the inclusion of some new stuff, and I hope will be a series of articles. So, what I'm going to work through today is I'm hoping to argue and show to you all how an understanding of Black trans thought, Black trans theory, and Black trans studies can, as a spatial project, in addition to its recognition as an intellectual inquiry and intercommunal kind of historicization as well as political theory, allows us for a deeper and more precise analysis of the constructed environment of our current societies. And that this analysis can be something that is useful not just for Black studies, for trans studies, or even Black trans studies, but can be useful for any kind of project that is, to varying degrees, that is struggling against white supremacy, racial capitalism, and colonialism. So, So, yeah, this first piece, which is from Marcus Bay. Marcus Bay has a quote in this piece, "The Blackness of Transness and the Transness of Blackness," where they write, "Manifesting in the modern world differently as race and gender fugitivity, Black and trans, though pointed at by bodies that identify as Black and or trans, precede and provide the foundational condition for those fugitive identificatory demarcations. In short, what I seek to do is, as my title suggests, demonstrate the ways in which trans is Black and Black is trans, though I cannot cause the fictive Blackness meets transness volume to materialize as an academic tone. I can come close by showing how they perennially speak with, through, alongside, and back to, or alternatively, Black to one another. Over there on, quote, the outskirts of the order of purity." And I want to pair this with C. Riley Snorton's concepts and ideas of transitivity and transversality as both Black on both sides and racial history of trans identity. Where Snorton writes, "Although the perception that race and gender are fixed and knowable terms is the dominant logic of identity, in this book, trans is more about a movement with no clear origin and no point of arrival, and Blackness signifies upon an enveloping environment and condition of possibility. Trans, in each of its permutations, finds expression and continuous circulation with Blackness, and Blackness is transected by embodied procedures that fall under the sign of gender." And so, riffing on both of these texts as well as some other pieces of scholarship from Black trans scholars, I'm arguing that Black trans theory here offers us, and any kind of study and look at space as a project, a route which can reveal these kinds of transitive elements of our manufactured space. And so by that, what I mean is the kinds of logics that are constantly in motion to reorganize our spaces, and the spaces and the logics that sort of go into how we police them don't quite ever stay stable. They're constantly in motion in order to be able to police people, right? And so I'm arguing here that transivity, however, though that reveals perhaps this kinds of logic that organizes that space, it's not the solution to what we might call dominant geographies, the spaces that have been constructed to police, confine, and control racialized and gender folks. But rather, transitivity can be a kind of rereading or re-rendering of that space, the ways in which Black trans folks make these spaces useful. And so if Black trans theoretical attentiveness to space allows us to view how geographies are continually in motion through counter-movements and these reconfigurations, then Black trans thought can be a crucial analytic which highlights and emphasizes Catherine McKittrick's reading of Sylvia Wynter on this concept of demonic grounds. That is to say that Black trans theory as an focal point to Black geographies and geographies more broadly kind of reveals that for us, right? And so what I'm arguing throughout this project is that spatial methodologies more broadly necessitate revelation, interrogation, and a reckoning of racialized, gendered, and sexualized ways that, as well as class ways that space is constructed. And so this will help us reveal the purpose of racism, sexism, heterosexism, and classism in moving these spaces and continuing to reinforce ideas around these spaces. And so speaking to Selene Vivace, a Black trans activist and performer in the Rosina favela in Rio de Janeiro, Dora Santana notes on her expression of living life and in order to keep surviving an interesting quote. So she writes, I told her that I'm very interested in the strategies that we as trans and Black people use to not be broken at the end of the day after transphobic racist aggressions. What do you do? I asked. And Selene took a deep breath and responds, well, nobody ever asked me that question. I'm going to tell you what I do. She paused. I vivo a vida, Dora. I vivo a vida. I live life, Dora. I live life. Viva vida, or living life, then it becomes a kind of call to keep that space of hope within us as we move forward, but aware of the oppressive systems we move within. And so I think that a framework of Black translation or Black trans reading practice here can use this kind of ethic in order to be able to understand the implications of space more generally speaking. And so this framework of Black translation helps us to observe Santana as well as Vivace's commitments to engaging liminal spaces of hope, right? To insist on continuing to live despite the hostile terrains we find ourselves in. And this being proclaimed by Black trans folks like Vivace is a recognition that geographic transformations are something that we can do, right? So we may not be able to actually physically change certain spaces. This may not be a kind of abolitionist possibility, but there is a way to still insist and persist. And so this focus on living life, I think, is an important one in this kind of observation, as it demonstrates the usefulness of a Black trans spatial reading practice in emphasizing that the creative, as it requires creativity, as well as alternate experiences of these hostile geographies, which can allow for joy, resilience, and love, even within, and certainly I would also argue against, these kinds of spatial logics of domination. And this is important, right? Because I think that on the one hand, or I'm arguing here that Black trans thought can reveal to us the kind of boundaries of public accessibility, or one way that we can understand that. So we know that there is, or I'm telling you now that there is, if you're not aware, this kind of global and national local like right-wing movement against like or that's considers itself to be anti-gender ideology, which really means anti-trans, and anti-CRT, which really means like anti-Black studies, ethnic studies, any of that, right? And so some critical attention to these laws, policies, and the discourse around them can reveal that Blackness and transness are both being repositioned at the edge, right? If not necessarily, perhaps, in fact, in excess of public acceptability. When considering this in the context of perceptions of progress for Black people and trans people in recent years, and even fields like Black studies, ethnic studies, and gender studies, we can start to see how a backlash to these perceived progresses, thinking about, the election of President Obama as a perception of progress, whether that's a reality or not, right? And then just the rise in public, status and celebrity for various trans actors and other celebrities as a kind of perception here. But if we recognize this, right, we're seeing a kind of backlash to these communities and that wants to render Blackness and transness as antisocial and, in fact, antithetical to the kind of democratic and U.S. not world order, but social order. And thus, in need of regulation and even disappearing within the context of the public sphere. And of course, we should acknowledge that this backlash is happening in response to these perceived kinds of progressions, despite the fact that there is this constant threat, not even threat, but actual reality for Black folks and trans folks today, particularly Black trans folks, of state and state-sanctioned violence, right? So Black people are continuing to be assaulted and killed en masse, right? regardless of gender identity. And like trans folks are also receiving this harassment as well as death too. So still, I think that the attention to the lives and work of public and creative Black trans intellectuals reveals a range of multifaceted strategies for resisting and subverting these hostile geographies and insisting upon Black trans futures, which might be useful for thinking about a future abolitionist world for all of us. And so we can think about the work of figures like Miss Major Griffin Gracie and the TGI Justice Project, which is an abolitionist project aiming to address the rates, the ways in which trans women of color are incarcerated and policed and controlled by the state. We can do the work of the late Marsha P. Johnson and the street transvestite action revolutionaries to take care of youth, right? Queer and trans youth in the streets who need this kind of help. We can think about the work of the late Monica Roberts in journalism and the late Tyler Brodas, and thinking about in legal scholarship, and thinking about the ways in which this helps us too, as well as various artists like Termaline and Juliana Huxtable. I think it's important to think about these people and not just the scholars that I mentioned at the beginning, because they help us to reveal these kinds of organizational logics of these geographies of domination, right? You can see how quite carceral the space is for Black trans folks. You're good. You can see how carceral space is for Black trans folks, right? With their constantly being released, and because Black trans folks exist on the edge of high rates of unemployment and various other things, they have high rates of homelessness as well too, and so the kind of anti-homeless infrastructure is really important for us to focus on here as well. However, like these kinds of narratives of weakness and violence are not the whole being, right? There's also these strategies I mentioned with these figures of resistance, subversion, and insistence against the space. And in the remaining time I have, and I certainly don't have time for this song, but I want to focus on just one figure who will be the subject of some of the articles, of one of the articles that will come out around this. And that is Shea Diamond. And so I argue that Shea Diamond, through her Seen It All EP, which is her debut EP as a singer-songwriter, post her incarceration, takes up this idea that I call soul spatialities. And so soul spatialities names how Diamond's performance of soul music, both within and outside the prison, positions her own creative geographic navigation against carceral logics which presuppose Black trans domination and subordination. Diamond's soul spatialities contained within and communicated across the ABBP Seen It All echo many of the politics and spatial strategies that Black geography scholar Clyde Woods identifies within blues and hip-hop music. In this way, similar to Woods' depiction of hip-hop geographies and blues geographies, soul spatialities takes up and makes up lineage, which, with blues epistemologies, which position social and spatial knowledges within the sphere of community-articulated and served politics. Thus, Diamond's music functions as a kind of trans or re-articulation of blues epistemologies into soul spatialities. And as a theory and practice, this idea of soul spatialities creatively expresses and theorizes the geopolitical domination of Black trans and defends a particularly exploited Black class, although all Black classes are in the United States and the diaspora, while offering resilience and reimagining strategies which emerge from their particular racial, gendered class positions. And she's taken up a legacy not in and of her own. You think of the trans soul singer from the 1950s and 60s, Jackie Shane, who fled the United States in order to be able to continue her career. And so Diamond is particularly important here, and I'll say this to wrap it up, right? Because her singer-songwriting career begins while she's incarcerated in men's prisons for 10 years, post armed robbery, so that she could actually gain access to gender confirmation, gender affirmation surgery, right? And so while she's incarcerated in these prisons, she's regularly brought into solitary for gender deviance and for not following the codes of the prison that she's supposed to be doing. And if you know anything about solitary, you know it's really here meant to break the soul, right? Meant to make you comply. And she doesn't do that. In fact, she embraces this Black form of music, soul, right? In order for not ever soul breaking. And a Black trans perspective on this doesn't just reveal that there are ways that we can subvert these kinds of hostile geographies, right? Because in fact, she's not she's doing this singing, songwriting, right? But she talks to us, or she talks to me when I talk to her about how, well, she's in prison actually, and she's doing this singing songwriting where she doesn't have access to a piece of paper to write this, so she's just practicing again and again and again. But on this cell block, right, in this prison of mostly cis men, right, and we have these kinds of logics and ideas that it would be an unsafe space for her. It's unsafe because of the stick, right? However, they're cheering her on. She says there were things like, "You go, girl, sing it, I want to hear that again, play the last one for me, you better sing the last one again for me too." So kind of Black Panther perspective on space, but it does here, these soul spatialities reveal for us a kind of, for a moment. But what it does for us is that it kind of reveals for us a way that you can continue to work, let's say work here, it's W-E-R-K, right? Continue to work towards progress, work towards liberation, work towards freedom, and part of that is also working towards community. So, thank you.
That was such a great way to end our time. Okay, we're going to start the Q&A, and I have the pleasure of asking the first question, so don't feel like, yes, we do.
Oh, sorry, that was my one.
Oh,
It's like broken.
I have the pleasure of asking the first question, so students, you can go ahead and start getting your questions ready. No pressure, right? All right, let's remember I'm a political scientist, so this is a little pie in the sky. This is a little pie in the sky, all right? So my question is, we know that academia has a proclivity to take a top-down approach to how we want to understand the world, okay? And so when I was looking at all these topics, I was like, what can I ask that really would engage us all in conversation? And so I was thinking about this top-down approach, and I really want you all to emphasize for the room, for the students, why it's essential that we amplify the voices of the unheard, especially in this anti-Black, anti-LGBTQIA, anti-insert whatever here world that we're currently existing in. That's a big question. There's many ways you can go with this, so go where the spirit leads you.
I think I can answer it very quickly, and then maybe other people time to think about it. But yeah, so for me, I really like the framing of the question, right? The work to amplify these voices, right? Because in fact, I don't think that they're unheard voices, right? They are just voices that are, well, on the one hand, actively suppressed, right? And then also voices that we think go as unheard because people are already marginalized in society, right? They're on the edges of the edge. So I think this amplification is a really important framing because we need to speak to people on the margins, not just in the margins and who've been marginalized and oppressed, but on the margins within marginalized communities too, right? To understand truly what needs to be done in order to move towards justice. And moving towards justice for some of the most maligned people in your own communities is in fact moving towards justice for your community as a whole. If we're taking kind of a radical approach and stance to that I think, and many Black feminist scholars and Black abolitionist scholars would argue, as well as activists, is doing a kind of like freedom work that is necessary for us.
Thank you. I'm going to add to that one of the things that I think that is so important is to recognize that the state and capital are incredibly good at erasing what has happened and histories of resistance, right? And so, like for me, when I was working with this footage, I just started from this kind of like, here's, 3 minutes of film, and had to go back and pull out and tease out, what do I know? I'm from Florida, so I know a little bit about the ecosystems. What do I know about the history? What can I find, right? Because, and we see it even in like the image I showed where, the logging project has run through, they build a railroad and then heavy log all the trees and they're just gone, right? That's like, literally we can see there the process of the state and capital attempting to erase the places, the geographies, right, of resistance. And so finding where we can tell those stories and putting them back into the landscapes, back into our geographical sort of readings of things, I think is so crucial.
Just to add to both my panelists, those were such great responses. I'm thinking about this from a decolonization lens and thinking about spatiality and kind of deconstructing certain narratives that have been reinforced through colonization. And I think a lot of that work is reasserting different forms of traditions and heritage. And like I was thinking about this in terms of my talk with oral storytelling, like something that has been actively suppressed in many ways, and especially within the diaspora context, there's a lot of suppression of different kinds from within the community. So I think part of that I'm thinking is like even decolonization constructs within the community as well. And now I'm thinking, I don't know if that relates back to your question as much, but.
It definitely does.
I wanna talk about the educational perspective. I always ask my students to think about what you can do with your education to contribute to society, and have you ever thought about the most marginalized people, like incarcerated people? So a lot of students I taught had never thought about incarcerated people. They had biases against incarcerated people. Also, many students said they couldn't make connections between their own lives and marginalized communities. And also we were talking about interconnections between fiction, literature, and the world we live in. So bringing incarcerated people's voices, students can learn from their spiritual, intellectual transformation through education. So yeah, that's why I introduce incarcerated students. Also, I've learned a lot from my students at Parchment, prison, and other carceral settings. That's why, it's important to share their voices in the freer world.
Now we're going to turn it over to the audience. Do you all have any questions for our panelists?
I loved all these talks, and I had a question, and I just wanted to remark on the fact that so many of you really helped me think about the politics of space when it comes to seeing it through the lens of people who are often marginalized on that space and how they experience it. And I just found that really just evocative and grounding in me thinking about this. But my question is for Kyrie. I wanted to see if you could elaborate on the notion of the Black transspatial reading practice that you talk about, because I found that so interesting in thinking about new ways of approaching like a critical lens from a queer perspective. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Yeah.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, because I think it's the thing in the project that I think I obviously skipped over the most here, and also am in the middle of developing a little bit more now too, right? But it is kind of my method. It is kind of the methodological intervention I think that I'm trying to make, right? Originally, I was going to call this piece when I was just thinking about methods, something around Black trans geographic method, so I think with this idea of a Black transspatial reading practice, what I'm trying to get at, right, is what would it mean for us to take seriously the work of Black trans scholarship, but also of Black trans public and creative intellectuals, right, artists, songwriters, journalists, etc. Take their work and their thought seriously, and also Black trans folks generally speaking, and think about space and how it's experienced from their perspective, right? And then would we be able to understand how carceral some of the spaces that we just encounter regularly really are, right? Be able to understand the implications of anti-homeless geography, of anti-homeless infrastructure that's just going up at bus stops, right? Be able to understand like all of the implications of prisons, right? I think we know how degradatory they are, right? But then to think about someone who spends most of her time, like like when she's incarcerated in men's prison, right? But then think about who spends most of her time in solitary for her safety, right? And what that reveals to us, right, is that solitary we know is this kind of horrible thing, or I hope we know this, right, or we're learning that it's this horrible thing. But from a Black trans perspective, like we can now read this space as like just how like casually it is there, right? Because she's made to go in again and again and again, all under the guise, at least according to the state, of either her non-compliance or that we're protecting you from your fellow like prisoners, right? Even though she argues that she found a trans community in prison and connected with larger Black communities in prison, and that she didn't feel all that unsafe from, I mean, she says sometimes she did, right? But she didn't feel as unsafe from other people that she's incarcerated with as she did from the state and its actors, right? The actual construction of the space, right? So a kind of Black trans reading or spatial reading practice lets us see these kind of hostile terrains too, but also how you can work against them is kind of what I'm trying to get at here, right? How these spaces are alternatively usable so that you can insist and persist.
Hi, I think I have the next question. So one of my areas of research is on border imperialism, which I presented on this morning, but another aspect is using a state prison archive. And so this question is for Alexandra and any of the panelists if they feel moved to answer. But so in an archive, it feels like you're constantly hitting a wall of connecting with individual people, like you were talking about with the video. And so I'm just curious about that process for you of reaching the wall and then kind of the wall of what's known and having to push beyond that. I was just the process and what goes through your mind and how you kind of feel moved to move forward in that sense.
Yeah, thank you. That's such a great question. I'll say that for me, I think a lot of my political education around what I can do in the archive comes directly from abolitionist thinkers and abolitionist movements and being in community with abolitionists, right? And going to those kind of methods and thought models has been really helpful for me in figuring out, you know, okay, so there's a wall, do we tear it down, do we go over it, do we go around it, right? What are the kind of different ways that we can address the gaps and the sort of foreclosures of the archive? And that work, like that piece of thinking about how do abolitionists think about this stuff, has also really led me to rooting things in indigenous knowledge, right? And so to start from where are we physically and what can we know there, and then how can we kind of make these connections between what the people who are native to the place know and knew and what their histories were, and then all the things that came after that. And a lot of it is also, I think, like figuring out how to read state documentation in counter-read that, right? And so to understand, you know, if you have a space that is broken up into counties, well, when did that happen? It was probably a direct result of the forced relocation of indigenous people off of that land here in the US, right? And so thinking through the histories that the land holds, I think has been the other kind of really crucial way that I get into, like, how do I get around or through or over or tear down those walls? I hope that made sense and helped.
No, it did. Thank you.
Hello, my question is to Dr. Sharmil Jariola. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I like the way you talked about oral literature in South Asia and how English language has been used as a tool for elitism, which is still being practiced in all the subcontinental countries. So my question to you is, do you think the revival of oral literature or oral culture per se can be used against this elitism created by English language?
Thank you. Yes, I think in many ways it can, especially with the way that kind of digital media and social media specifically are used as part of that interaction. I think part of that concerted effort comes from not only the diaspora, but from people within the homelands, within the motherland, however we want to classify it. So I think also there is a deep-rooted history of kind of a hierarchy of specific ancestral languages over others. So I think that utilizing oral history as a method can be very powerful in kind of overcoming different forms of colonial oppression in the many different ways that they present.
Thank you.
I think I'm next here. So this is a question for all the panelists, but as a student who studies ethnic studies, I find it can be hard at times to find a sense of hope when studying such hard histories. And so my question is, how do you guys find hope and motivation to continue these projects and just continue on?
I am familiar with Korean literature. Like, we were colonized by Japan, so we share similarities between African American experiences. And so, like, I find hope whenever I see marginalized students find ways to like freedom. For instance, my incarcerated student, he had never taken college courses before, and his parole was denied. Then, he would never get another chance for the parole hearing. Then he wrote to me after he took like African American literature courses through the prison to college pipeline program at the University of Mississippi. The parole board decided that he was incapable of functioning in free society, but he's been incarcerated for 40 plus years. He's a model, like, prisoner. Like, he's an artist, but the prison, doesn't see him that way. So he meticulously read their, statement, and he argued against. And he was, saying, I used textual evidence. So yeah, education is really important. Then I, share my students' stories with my non-incarcerated students. They are motivated. So yeah, I find hope in that way.
I think for me, I find hope in a lot of different ways. Part of it is working with students, and kind of similar to what you were saying, like I think even within the ivory tower within academia, like kind of seeing the light bulb moment or seeing students interested in a topic, whatever it may be, even if it's something that's not directly connected to the class, but something that's opened up their eyes, I think is always something that's motivating. And then also for me, as I've been researching this topic and then a few other topics, just finding people who are not in academia doing the work, I think that's also very motivational because it provides a different lens, and it almost like makes connection as well between academia and community. I think sometimes academia can be very isolating in that respect, so I think finding connection and then also, kind of for me, like reinforcing my practice within community as well is an important place.
I want to say also that a great lesson for me has been to not discount the power of spite. So hope, I mean, is so super important, and I completely agree. But also, right, spite will get you there too. Yes, absolutely, right? And so, right, a lot of what keeps me going, doing this work is, and not just like this work, but also like the community work and stuff, is to think about who we've lost and to think about all of the middle fingers I want to give to the people who took them from us, right? And I do have to temper that with hope sometimes, because an all spite diet is like kind of unhealthy. But sometimes it's like you got to go to that well, I think sometimes.
I don't know if I'm supposed to answer, but also, just to build off of that, I look at the literature and the things that have come before me. So in The Salt Eaters by Tony K. Guevara, the opening scene is essentially like this spiritual healing session. But the main premise of it is that the person that they're trying to heal has to make the declaration that they want to be well. And so before I send my students off into the world, when they leave me, I tell them to be well, because I have made the commitment to be well. And I tell them that they also need to make the commitment to be well, because that's what the institution does not want us to do. And so I find hope, hopefully, in my wellness and be striving to be well.
Yeah, I just want to say thank you to all four of you for that, because I actually am very, I think I do struggle with, not feeling a lot of hope, actually, doing the work that I do. So, even if I try to talk about hope and resilience, too. Yeah, so I think it's a good reminder that everyone other than me offered.
Yeah, I didn't mention this after, like he found the textual evidence, and he argued against. He wrote a parole protest letter, and he got another chance for the parole hearing. So.
Is there time for?
Do we have time,
Yes,
guys?
we have time for
Okay.
one more.
Yep. You the last one.
Okay, I'm just thinking about the topic of the previous panel about the challenges of getting some of this knowledge to younger audiences, and at the same time, all this criminalization of this idea of what is age appropriate, and we talked about the limits of the permissible, right? And I'm wondering, y'all may have not thought about it, but I'm just curious if y'all could think about out of the research that you do, how would you present it to a younger audience? Have you considered a younger high school audience or middle school audience for the work that you do, and what do you think they might be able to get from the work? Go ahead and break all the walls.
I have thought about this a lot. So I don't know if I have like a solution, but I thought about things in, obviously not in university presses and paywall journals. And so I've thought about things like, although there's still pay sometimes associated with some of these things, but I thought about things like podcasts. I've just also thought about, I have a colleague who's been talking to me a lot about trying to get some of these stories and narratives into children's book form and stuff too, right? And I also think, I think I think that these things need to go out to people who are young still, right? We change the way we talk about them, but I don't think we radically alter and shift the way that we talk about them though, because they must also understand this. And yeah, so there's no solutions in what I'm saying right now, but I've been thinking about this a lot. So thank you for the question, because now I'm thinking.
I don't think I have, similarly, I've been thinking a lot about this. I really enjoyed the previous panel and learned a lot, especially about the work that's being done with this, specifically in the context of being in Texas. And it's something I think about a lot, because even in the university, we know, I think we all know about the regulations and laws that have been passed against the teaching of so much of what we teach and what we're talking about here in not only K through 12 schools, but in colleges and universities. So I think about what that message looks like when we're not able to utilize certain language to portray that message. And yeah, I don't think I have any answers, but it is something I consider a lot. And I just want to say I appreciated the previous panel because it is something that motivated a lot of questions for me. Yeah, that wasn't very helpful, but.
I actually give my students collaborative social justice projects, which are not, like really difficult to do. So students are from different fields. They can work together. For instance, after we read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, students who are studying music and, and environmental science, and other students are studying literature and other majors, and they created a music video about environmental issue, addressing environmental issues. So they love music. Music is very approachable, and they incorporated tea cakes, blues into the music video, so they can think about difficult subjects while they were while they are working on this collaborative project, so they can also learn from each other. So yeah.
I do it when I think about community, because it operates completely outside the academy. And how can I use what I am researching in the academy and actually apply it in my community? So, and in spaces normally where kids are not coming as much anymore, or places that are, I want to say, kind of dying out, like churches or small, different community organizations, Boys and Girls Club, or more so some of these lower than Jack and Jill, but kind of Jack and Jill-esque type of spaces, because I study what Black folks know about politics and how they come to know what they know. So I think about how can I be one of the people that I had in my life that taught me something about Black politics and what Black people know about politics. Where can I insert myself to help teach the next generation of Black kids, Black folks? And I think that is time. Thank y'all for coming so much.